Deutschland Trek. It all started when groups of geographically isolated Boers became disgruntled by the authorities of the various Boer republics in the 1870s. Many of these Boers were very undereducated and hyper-religious. They held disdain for the more progressive policies of Transvaal. They also thought the British Empire was part of a new world order predicted in the Book of Revelation. They all decided to make their new promised land deeper into the interior of Africa. About 60 people left the Boer town of Pretoria and embarked on their journey. They had traveled across the Kalahari Desert, which the Boers had called the Thirst Land. They arrived at Lake Ngami and the nearby village of Ganzi, where they settled temporarily while trying to buy land in Namibia, which was still somewhat occupied as territory of the Herero and Orlam tribes. But it was a fruitless effort. Eventually, the trekkers were going through great confusion until they were absorbed into the other groups of Deutschland trekkers. The second group of trekkers were a larger group which decided to split into separate groups to travel across the Thirst Land. The trekkers spiraled into paranoia from being there without permission from a chieftain named Kama. They knew that what they were doing was highly dangerous. They started to turn on each other, which led to complete chaos. The trekkers had lost control of their cattle, which ran off never to be seen again. There was so little water to go around that people had to ration water by spoon and slit the throats of their own goats to drink their blood. Miraculously, nobody actually died of thirst, but there were deaths caused by malaria, which was a common disease to catch when this deep in Africa. A third group of trekkers had absorbed the other two. They had slowly recovered from the last trek and began heading further north along the Okavango River. This time, even more people had been killed by malaria, and many of their oxen were killed from tsetse flies. This caused the last surviving trekkers to split up. Some of them turned back to Transvaal. Some tried to go directly back into the desert to escape the diseases and flies, and the rest decided to keep moving northwest along the river. The last group, going north, had even more people killed off from eating poisonous plants, malaria, and attacks from Kalahari Bushmen. By the time the other group of trekkers found them, they were shocked by how much hardship they had gone through. The trekkers reunited and brought more resources with them. Even more hardships followed in their new promised land in the deserts of Namibia. They were surrounded by hostile native tribes, and the land was barren and inhospitable. Many of them went back to South Africa, but others decided to keep moving north until they found greener pastures. Finally, the trekkers went as far as the unexplored inland regions of the Portuguese colony of Angola. They had explored a mostly uninhabited stretch of land called Kyoko Land. They would build new settlements there, but would often get attacked by the hostile Ovambo tribe. The Portuguese had promoted the white colonization of the inland to push back enemy native tribes and a possible invasion by the British Empire. Although there were very few Boers who actually made it up to Angola. In later generations, some decided to trek all the way back to South Africa, and some most likely stayed and assimilated with the native tribes. Revolt of the Muckers. A German-Brazilian woman named Jacobina Mentzmüller was born in a German immigrant town in Brazil called Novo Hamburgo. She was raised in a religious Baptist household. Her parents were German-born immigrants who fled from the political turmoil of Germany to make a new life for themselves in southern Brazil. When Jacobina grew up, she married another highly religious German immigrant man named Johann Georg Maurer. She would develop a medical condition where she would suddenly faint occasionally, and she would often sleepwalk during the night. In a highly rural, hyper-religious community, medical diagnoses were rare, and often the villagers would quickly jump to superstition. The villagers started to believe that Jacobina Jacobina had divine powers. They soon were convinced that she was sort of a new messiah of God. She and Jorg began a fanatical cult, which Jacobina was worshipped. The cult would often get in fights with the outsiders. This cult would then be referred to as the Muckers. The Brazilian authorities would become suspicious of this cult, and they eventually looked through Jacobina's home and found that she had been hoarding firearms for her doomsday cult. She was briefly arrested and put in jail. While there, she fainted due to her medical condition. She was taken to the hospital where the doctor tried to wake her up. She only woke up when her followers were brought to the hospital and sang to the unconscious Jacobina for 5 hours. When she awoke, she returned to her hometown. She became even more popular to the other villagers. Jacobina then commanded her followers to exterminate the rest of the non-believers in her town, which her cult called the Sputters. This then escalated into a revolt against the Brazilian authorities. There were some successful skirmishes against the authorities, but later on, as more violence ensued, a mucker named Carlos Luper had defected to the police and exposed the hiding place of the cult. The cultists were massacred by the authorities, and their bodies were thrown into a mass grave. Afterwards, there were still some violent muckers that survived and kept trying to kill people, but they were fewer and farther between by the end of the 1800s. The First Boer War. Throughout the decades of the mid to late 1800s, the Boer republics, the native African kingdoms, and mixed race republics were slowly getting annexed by the encroaching British Empire, one by one. These lands in central and northern South Africa were rich in diamonds. Eventually, the Boers began to voice their disdain towards British rule and declared independence. British troops were quickly deployed to suppress the Boer uprising. The Boers used their guns and horses for their rugged everyday lifestyle. They were expert marksmen. They also learned efficient battle tactics from all of the times they had fought the Zulus. The Boers were able to easily fight off the overconfident British armies who had underestimated them in several battles. The Boers were using an early form of trench warfare to protect themselves from British heavy artillery. The British soldiers wore bright red uniforms, which made it easier for the Boers to snipe them. This was the first time the British Empire had been defeated in war since the American Revolution. German colonial empire, Germany. During the late 1800s, the newly founded German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted to establish Germany as a powerful and influential colonial empire to compete with the British, French, and Russian colonial empires. In an event of rapid European colonialism in Africa, called the Scramble for Africa, the German Empire had obtained several large areas of land in sub-Saharan Africa. Europeans were not able to do this only a few decades before, since there was no modern medicine to protect European explorers from lethal tropical diseases. The German Empire also sought to establish colonies in the newly explored islands of the Pacific Ocean, Togoland. The first land in Africa acquired by the German Empire was a small wedged-out strip of tropical jungle in the middle of West Africa named Togoland. For centuries, Europeans would trade with the native coastal Togo peoples during the Atlantic slave trade. The German Empire had taken control of the coastal area from the native king Mlapa III. Germany had heavily controlled its main towns of Lomé, Sebe, and Anejo. The Germans extended their control further inland and conquered the lesser-known and less wealthy tribes. Togoland was one of Germany's most developed colonies due to its modern railroad infrastructure system. Cameroon, one of the main areas of sub-Saharan Africa that was now under German rule, was Cameroon, another much larger territory in West Africa that was mostly made up of dense tropical jungles and lush green savannas. Most of the native Bantu and Pygmy peoples were already contacted by Portuguese Christian missionaries. But in the most northern inland regions, where the Sultanate of Bamum resided, Islam was more prominent. The German Empire fiercely conquered and subdued all of the native tribes and kingdoms of this region. Commercial companies ruled different areas of the vast territory. The companies used forced labor on the natives to harvest cash crops, such as bananas and rubber from plantations. Namibia, next, a region in southwestern Africa, became a colony of the German Empire. The land was much more arid and had vast, beautiful, reddish deserts. The native San and Damara tribes had already been contacted very briefly by the Portuguese many hundreds of years before, which was why they had old European firearms and even Christian beliefs. Just before any European conquests of the land would occur, German, Swedish, and Finnish Lutheran missionaries would extensively explore the alien deserts of Namibia and tried to convert native tribes to Lutheranism. The German Empire would annex this very large swath of land. The colony of Namibia had the most coastline out of any other German colony in Africa. Because of the large coastline, the lack of extremely dense jungle, and warm but not too hot weather, the Germans saw this as a good place to colonize. German settlers began to lightly populate the area and build towns and cities with lots of mines. While German forces were expanding their territory further into the interior, the Orlam people, who had recently migrated from further south, fleeing from Boer expansion, had waged war against the Herero people. It was only until the German armies arrived when both groups would be aggressively subdued. Tanganyika. The most important African colony of the German Empire was Tanganyika, a tropical land on the rich Swahili coast. It was mostly made up of semi-arid savannas and rugged mountainous terrain further inland, the most notable mountain being Mount Kilimanjaro. It also touches the largest lake in Africa, Lake Victoria. The Swahili coast already had a history of Iranian and Arab Islamic colonization dating back almost 1,000 years. The descendants of Middle Eastern colonists were the aristocracy of the region, and the city of Zanzibar was the capital of the massive East African slave trade. Right before German rule, up to 90% of people in Tanganyika were slaves. British missionaries began exploring the inner savannas and converting the inland tribes to Christianity. The German Empire annexed the lands of Tanganyika. German companies would use the colony to establish plantations for cash crops by enslaving the native population. The wealth of the colony would later attract a lot of Indian migrants to settle in the colony. Papua New Guinea. It was a large chunk of territory on the Melanesian island of Papua New Guinea. The Germans preemptively declared this land as part of their empire to stop the British from taking control of the entire large island. This region was called Kaiser Wilhelm's Land. It was entirely made up of extremely dense equatorial jungles. Europeans briefly tried to spread Christianity throughout the hundreds of Austronesian tribal groups and cultures of the island, but it wasn't all that successful. The Germans later annexed the territory and began sending more Lutheran missionaries to convert some of the native tribes. The German New Guinea Company had established several plantations and used the indigenous people for free labor. Nauru. The German Empire also ruled a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean called Nauru. It was a beautiful tropical paradise island with white sandy beaches and an oceanic breeze. The native peoples were a mix of Melanesians and Polynesians, who were mostly fishermen. The 12 tribes of Nauru were a very hierarchical culture, most likely due to a lack of resources. Shipwrecked Europeans would also live on the island and trade alcohol and guns with the locals. The tribes of Nauru waged wars with one another with their new firearms for 10 years until the German Empire annexed the island. Phosphate was discovered by the Germans, and the island became mostly used as a phosphate mining colony. Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands were a group of tiny tropical islands in the Micronesian region of the Pacific Ocean. They were home to Polynesian peoples, who also had a hierarchical caste system. They mainly were fishermen in the various lagoons. The Marshallese commonly killed their third-born children as a form of population control due to frequent famines. American missionaries had already spread Christianity throughout the islands. The Marshallese were already fairly westernized prior to annexation. German traders would also begin to set up shop there as well. But with all of this European contact, lethal diseases would spread between populations. The German Empire usually annexed the islands through military intimidation. As the islands were now under German rule, companies would now extract the natural resources from the islands. Northern Mariana Islands. The Northern Mariana Islands were a large archipelago of tropical islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They were originally inhabited by Polynesian peoples called the Comoros. The Comoros were a highly spiritual people who practiced ancestral worship and human sacrifice. The Spanish had technically already claimed the islands as part of the Spanish East Indies, but the Spanish Empire never did much there. Christianity would be the main Western influence in the region. Most of the native population had died from various old world diseases which they had no immunity to. The islands were repopulated by other Pacific Islanders and Filipinos. Eventually, the Spanish Empire and the United States would go to war with each other, which resulted in the US giving the islands to the German Empire. The Germans built modern infrastructure there and exported a lot of copra oil. Micronesia. Another archipelago of tropical Pacific islands called Micronesia were at first under Spanish rule. The original peoples of the islands were Polynesians. Since these islands were populated with the same ethnicity as the Northern Mariana Islands, they shared a lot of the same history and culture. Micronesia was first under Spanish rule for centuries, but the Spanish didn't influence the region much until the Germans began influencing Micronesia, but never directly ruled it until after the Spanish-American War, when the United States gave them the islands. Under German rule, Micronesia had its resources extracted by commercial businesses. Some modern infrastructure was built there as well. Palau. A tropical Pacific archipelago called Palau was also first under Spanish rule. It was originally populated by Polynesian peoples that had a matrilineal culture and lived somewhat communally. Under Spanish rule, not much Western influence was to be had. After the Spanish-American War, however, the Germans were given control over the islands. The islands were mostly used for bauxite mining. Samoa. Finally, the furthest area to be colonized by the German Empire were the tropical Pacific islands of Samoa. Ever since the Dutch discovered Samoa in the 1600s, other European explorers found the islands, including French explorers during the 1700s. In the earlier parts of the 1800s, British missionaries converted the Samoans to Christianity. In later decades, the Samoan Civil War broke out between the islands, which made them ripe for Western annexation. The Germans took control of the Western Samoan Islands, while the United States took control of the Eastern Samoan Islands. The colony was mostly used for exporting copra and cocoa beans. A non-violent resistance movement in Samoa had formed under German rule, but was eventually shut down by the German colonial authorities, and their leader was banished to the Northern Mariana Islands. Belgian Congo Free State. There was a massive part of Central Africa that was almost completely unexplored by Europeans, known as the Congo Basin. It was made up of vast stretches of deep, dark equatorial jungle and flooded marshlands, with a mighty raging river running through it called the Congo River. It was home to countless species of plants and animals, ecosystems, and people groups. Most of the ethnic groups of this region consist of Bantu, Pygmy, and Nilotic descendant cultures. One of the largest ethnic groups are called the Congo people, which the land is named after. They spoke a Bantu language called Kikongo and had a spiritual religion based around how the seasons reflect the cycle of life. The land had barely been touched by the Portuguese during the 1400s, which led to some of the tribes of the Congo possessing European firearms. But Europeans wouldn't be able to explore the region extensively for hundreds of years due to the tropical diseases until the later 1800s. The monarch of the fairly new country of Belgium, King Leopold II, desired to have a colonial empire, much like the British, French, and Germans during the scramble for Africa. A Welsh-American explorer named Henry Morton Stanley was commissioned by King Leopold to explore all around the Congo Basin. Henry had extensively explored the deep jungles around the Congo River and Lake Victoria, contacting the various local kingdoms and tribes. He had suffered from horrific tropical diseases and parasites along the way, while he spent years building bridges and other basic infrastructure throughout the lands. Henry had various local chiefs sign treaties which they couldn't really understand that gave Leopold access to take over their lands. Eventually, King Leopold took full personal control of the territory. Leopold enslaved most of the population to extract rubber from rubber trees, as well as cultivating other cash crops. Elephants would be killed and have their tusks sawed off for their ivory. When the overworked local Congolese didn't reach a certain quota, they would have their hands cut off. The colonial authorities regularly abused the local women and children. Whenever the Congolese people rebelled, their resistance was brutally crushed, and many were horrifically tortured. These were the horrors of the Belgian Congo Free State. An American journalist named George Washington Williams had traveled to the Congo where he saw the atrocities committed by the colonizers. He and several others reported it to the press, which exposed Leopold's cruelty to the Congolese peoples. This caused Leopold to relinquish his personal control of the Congo to the Belgian government. Under the rule of the Belgian government, things would steadily improve. Second Boer War. Under President Paul Kruger, the Orange Free State became more wealthy and prosperous during the 1890s. The Transvaal Republic attempted to conquer into the Thirst Lands, but the native peoples there had opted to be annexed by the British Empire. The Empire later annexed most of the other lands further north of the Boer republics until they were entirely surrounded on all sides. Anglos that had migrated into the Boer republics to dig for gold had rebelled against the republics during this time. They had been propped up by the British Empire as an excuse to invade. The rebellions were unsuccessful, however. This worsened Anglo-Boer relations and even got the rivaling German Empire on the side of the Boers. During the turn of the century, the Boers finally declared war with the British Empire once again. Many Germans, Italians, Swedes, and Dutch people who had an equal disdain towards the British Empire volunteered to fight alongside the Boers. The British then began to take troops from all around their vast empire, such as soldiers from the British Isles, other parts of Africa, and the Indian subcontinent, Canada, and Australia to conquer the Boer republics. The Boers had resorted to guerrilla warfare. The British would then burn their crops and villages while capturing surrendering Boers and sending them to concentration camps. In these concentration camps, the Boers would starve to death in droves. In the end, all of South Africa had fallen under British rule. The Wild West. After the Mexican-American War, the United States had gained full territorial control over the beautiful rocky orange desert regions of North America. These lands in West Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and eastern California were home to the Apache and the Navajo Amerindian tribes. These tribes lived among the old ruins of the deceased Pueblo culture, which carved out buildings out of the sides of cliffs. The region wasn't thoroughly settled until after the American Civil War. Various Anglo-Americans from the post-war South were migrating west to escape from the political turmoil of the Reconstruction era. Black Americans would also find themselves in the Wild West, as they had just recently been freed from slavery. Anglo-Americans from the North also came to the region. There were many European immigrants from Germany and Britain who came as settlers of the final parts of the American frontier. There were also Chinese immigrants who came to North America to work on railroads that would interconnect the West Coast to the Mississippi region. These various different migrants would often come into conflict with the native Amerindians and the few Mexican vaqueros who were already there when these lands were still controlled by the Mexican Empire. Because of the rapid influx of migrants and settlers, there was a general lack of law and order, which made the area extremely dangerous. Criminal vagabonds, vigilantes, and train robbers were much more common. A large chunk of the North American continent in the far northwest, previously owned by the declining Russian Empire called Alaska, had been purchased by the United States during the 1860s. White American settlers wouldn't populate most areas thoroughly until there was a gold rush during the end of the 1800s. The Native Americans in Alaska, the Aleuts, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, and the Yupik peoples were hunter-gatherers for the vast majority of human history, since the ground was almost always frozen with permafrost, making the natural evolution of agriculture never able to occur. Many of these native tribes had a matrilineal culture and rich mythology. During the beginning of the 1900s, Anglo-Germanic settlers from the US, Anglo-Canadian settlers, German, Nordic, and British immigrants had migrated throughout the southern and coastal regions of Alaska. Most of the territory remained untouched, however. Porfiriato, a mestizo Mexican man named Porfirio Diaz, spent his early life in poverty during the dictatorship of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. He became a rebellious soldier during the Reform War and the French invasion of Mexico. Porfirio had been the main figure in winning the Battle of Puebla against the French armies and became a national war hero. He then seized power over the Mexican government as an authoritarian dictator. Under the Porfiriato, bandits and other common criminals were rounded up and shipped off to hard labor camps. Mexico went through a period of rapid modernization in the late 1800s to keep up with the colonial empires. During the turn of the century, the middle class and the wealthy elite were able to enjoy the economic benefits of Porfirio's policies, inviting in rich American investors, while the working class became even poorer than they already were. There was great discontent and resentment with the corrupt dictatorship during the early 1900s. A new democratic political candidate had appeared named Francisco Madero, had attempted to run against Porfirio Diaz in a corrupt election. Porfirio had Francisco arrested and put in prison for challenging his authority, but Francisco had escaped from prison and fled to the United States, where he called for an armed revolution against the regime. The Coloreds of South Africa, a new ethnic group descended from the Boers, Anglos, Khoisan, Bantus, and various Indian and Southeast Asian immigrant groups, all intermingling with each other, had emerged in South Africa. They were referred to as the Coloreds. They were often given less power and privilege than the white Boers and Anglos, but more power and privilege than the black Khoisan or Bantus in colonial South Africa. The Namibian Genocide. Under German colonial rule, the native peoples of Namibia were treated as an inferior race that would be exploited for their labor. The warlike people known as the Herero resisted German authority over their land the most, often came into conflict with the few German settlers. As an act of punishment, a German general named Lothar von Trotha had waged war against the Herero tribe and won the Battle of Waterberg, driving them deep into the barren inland deserts. Many of the Herero people died of thirst there. The Nama people also rebelled against the German colonial regime, but they were brutally massacred. The German government viewed the native peoples of Namibia as an inferior race, so the German authorities treated them with as much force, cruelty, and brutality as possible. They even sent the Herero and Nama people to concentration camps where they were put through back-breaking labor and were not treated for their various diseases. They were often victims of extreme abuse by the German authorities. The enslaved prisoners were used as human guinea pigs to be experimented on. Skulls from the dead victims were taken up to Germany to be used for craniometry research to try to show how the Caucasoid skull had a larger cranial capacity. The main goal of this genocide was to eradicate the native Namibian population to make way for German settlers. This horrific event was swept under the rug by most of the government, and most of the common German citizens had no idea that this was going on until much later. In the aftermath of the genocide, the last surviving prisoners were distributed across Namibia as enslaved manual laborers for the German settlers. The native people were completely stripped of all human rights and were forced to have metal discs with a registration number for identification. The Great War. In the year 1914, the new heir to the throne of the declining Austro-Hungarian Empire, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, had been assassinated by a radical Slavic nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. The Austro-Hungarian government then blamed their enemy country Serbia, and war was declared. The also declining Russian Empire saw the Austro-Hungarian invasion of Serbia as an aggression towards fellow Slavs. Tsar Nicholas II then deployed Russian troops to fight the Austrians and Hungarians to defend Serbia. The German Empire, the new great military power of Europe, ruled by Kaiser Wilhelm II, then declared war on the Russian Empire, since they were good allies with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The German Empire also declared war on one of Russia's main allies, the French Republic. The British Empire then declared war on the German Empire because of this. The Germans then invade partially into France, but were stopped by French and British forces to a standstill. This was where the beginning of trench warfare started in the Great War. The Germans then deployed the first submarines called U-boats, which sunk many British warships. The Russians attempted to invade Germany, but failed horribly and retreated. The Austro-Hungarian Empire successfully conquered some areas of Serbia during this time. The old and weak Ottoman Empire joined the Germans and Austro-Hungarians to invade into Russian territory through the Black Sea and the Caucasus. The German colony of Togoland had gotten invaded and taken over by the British. They tried to invade Cameroon, but were stopped by the German forces. Namibia, however, falls partially to the British. German forces in Tanganyika attempt to invade into British Kenya, but are driven back within their own territory, which they'd have to use guerrilla warfare to fight the British. German New Guinea and Samoa get annexed into British hands. Later on, the Germans bomb coastal English towns in hopes of beating the British in their own homeland. During Christmas of 1914, a temporary truce between the German and French French forces happened where the two armies would play football with each other. In 1915, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is unable to fully conquer Serbia in a humiliating defeat. Germany deploys the first Zeppelins, which would be used to bomb England once again. The Germans then set up naval blockades around the waters near the British Isles, so that the British wouldn't be able to import vital goods like food from anywhere else, which would lead to famines. On the Western Front, the Germans, French, and British battled to another trench deadlock, where chemical warfare would be implemented by the Germans. The French and the British also began to use chemical weapons to their advantage afterwards, as well as gas masks to protect themselves from chlorine gas inhalation. The SS Lusitania got shot down by a German U-boat, which killed many Americans that were on it. This caused the United States to side more with the Allies despite trying to remain neutral. Italy, being a rival of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, joined the Allied armies and entered the war. Both the Germans and Austro-Hungarians began advancing eastward into Russian territory. Bulgaria joined the Central Powers and helped the Austro-Hungarian Empire invade into Serbia successfully. The Italians attempted to invade the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but were unable to breach through the uphill Alps. In 1916, the Great War had developed into the first industrial and mechanized war. Humans became extremely efficient at killing each other, and the death toll from this war was in the millions. Eventually, Montenegro, an ally to Serbia, would be successfully invaded and taken over by the Austro-Hungarians. The British then were finally able to fully conquer all of German Cameroon. The Battle of Verdun would resemble a meat grinder from how bloody and violent this battle was. Almost everyone who fought in this battle on both sides were killed. The German Empire then declared war on Portugal, which had recently joined the Allies. Romania then joins the Allies and attempts to invade into the Austro-Hungarian territory of Transylvania, which was successful at first until the Austro-Hungarian, German, and Bulgarian forces arrive. The British attempt to break through the trench deadlock with the first tanks. In 1917, an American ship delivering wheat to Britain was sunk by German U-boats, which only made the US more likely to join the Allies to fight the Germans. The Germans then convinced the Mexican rebels in the Mexican Revolution to invade north into the US to distract the Americans from fighting in the Great War. The Americans later found out about this and officially joined the war by declaring war with the German Empire and joining the Allies. The Russian Empire erupts into an internal workers' revolution, and the collapsing Russian government withdraws from the war. The first warplanes are now being utilized in the Western Front of the war. The Germans had the technological advantage when it came to air battle. The British then start digging tunnels underneath German trenches and detonated mines underneath them. Many of the German trenches were destroyed. Many other countries all around the world, including Brazil and China, began aiding the Allies due to frequent German U-boat attacks. Recently industrialized Japan would then start conquering all of the German-controlled colonies in Oceania and incorporated all of them into the Empire of Japan. The Germans start to aid the Austro-Hungarians on the Italian front and begin pushing Italian troops back. In 1918, the Germans attempt to win a decisive victory against France in a last-ditch effort to end the war. But this is when American troops started to be deployed in France. The Americans, along with the British, also attempt to aid the White Russian nationalists against the Marxist Bolshevik Red Russians during the Russian Civil War. The Americans, French, and British troops begin to advance with more tanks. Both the German and Austro-Hungarian armies start to become demoralized as their governments are refusing to back down from the war. The Germans begin to retreat into their own homeland. The German government then attempts to sign a peace agreement with the United States. Woodrow Wilson then tries to get Kaiser Wilhelm II to abdicate his throne. The Austro-Hungarian Empire signs an armistice and opts out of the war since they were getting defeated by the Allies. The German colony of Tanganyika falls to the British by surrendering. In one last attempt at aggression against the British, the German government commands its navy to go on a suicidal mission into the North Sea. The navy refuses and mutinies, which escalates into a revolution against the corrupt monarchy. Finally, the German Empire, or the Second Reich, has been overthrown. Now, after all of this bloodshed, Germany has become a republic. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is now an exhausted shell of its former self. The ethnic tensions between the Austrians, Hungarians, Slavs, and Romanians had reached a boiling point. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would finally collapse into several new nationalist governments. This was the end stage for reactionary monarchies in the developed Western world.